These strange, nightmarish images come from the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a seminal work of German Expressionism. But what the hell is that? Germany had a pretty rough time following the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles effectively forced the country to pay back hundreds of billions to the Allied forces, reduce its military, and concede large amounts of previously German land to other countries. That's on top of the over 2 million German soldiers who died during the war, more than any other country involved. Amongst this mess, the one industry that actually did extremely well was the cinema. Because of a 1916 ban on foreign film imports, Germany had a huge demand for domestic releases. Coupled with the awful reality of war and its after effects, a new appetite for darkness infected the cinema. In order to express this on film, German directors turned to Expressionism, which is basically a means of portraying the world from a subjective perspective, using emotions to inform the look of the film. This is why Caligari looks like the hallucination of a madman. In a world where the authoritative power of an inhuman state had gone mad, individual people felt understandably disposable and insignificant. This film takes place in the town of Holstenwall, where two friends go to a fair and come across Dr. Caligari, the sinister owner of a young somnambulist, basically a sleepwalker, Cesare. He only awakens upon Caligari's command in order to tell fortunes. One of the men, Alan, asks Cesare how long he will live, and is told that he has until dawn. Sure enough, later that night, Alan is stabbed by a shadowy figure, and so begins Caligari's reign of terror. This film doesn't make a lot of sense, really. It's never even mentioned that you shouldn't exploit a human being as a carnival sideshow, and the investigation into the obviously guilty Caligari is woefully lackluster. They even fall for this obvious dummy as an alibi for where Cesare was at the time of the crime, but that's not really the point. Expressionism isn't about reality so much as it's about emotionally reacting to a cruel and insane world, and the relentlessly ugly set design is clearly meant to show that we're not playing by the rules of conventional story here. Caligari is one of the most viscerally disturbing movies of all time, not because it's gory, but because it's suffocatingly ugly. The jagged edges and shadows literally painted onto the sets are deliberately uncomfortable to look at, because this isn't about happy endings, it's about pain, and the inability to do anything meaningful about it. The film's ending lets it down though, revealing the whole thing to have actually been made up by a madman, which robs the film of a lot of its impact. In fact, the film's two screenwriters hated the ending, which was forced on them by the studio, or possibly by fellow Expressionist director Fritz Lang. A lot of information surrounding these films is unsurprisingly hazy. This unwillingness to allow films to end in a way that actually matches the tone of most of its runtime is something that recurs again and again in horror cinema, perhaps just because most audiences want to go home with a feeling of resolution. In fact, this is my main criticism of even the best of these films. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of German Expressionism is a bit uninspiring. Caligari's director Robert Wiener followed up his great triumph of insanity with a film that is just downright incomprehensible, and many of these films don't hold up terribly well today. From Morn to Midnight is stylistically interesting, but narratively deprived. Paul Wegener, the man who arguably first brought Expressionism to the cinema, came out with The Golem, which is both stylistically and narratively lacking, and Destiny by Fritz Lang is frankly just a bit boring. Probably the best German horror director from the 1920s was F.W. Murnau, who adapted the earliest surviving version of Bram Stoker's Dracula without bothering to acquire the rights first, a decision that would prove nearly fatal to his film Nosferatu: A Symphony of Terror. You see, Bram Stoker's widow found out about the film after she was for some reason sent a promotional poster, and tried to have every single print destroyed. Thankfully she was unsuccessful, and we can still watch one of the best screen versions of Dracula ever committed to celluloid. The Count, now renamed Orlok, was played by Max Schreck, whose surname translates as Fright in English. Appropriately so too, because Count Orlok is as outwardly monstrous as he is inwardly evil in this adaptation. Rather than creating a whole world of expressionistic sets like Caligari, Murnau chose to set his film in a more grounded world that would then be ripe for the invading by the insect-like Orlok. He moves with an otherworldly glide, his unnaturally long limbs and skinny frame making him look about as far from human as it's possible to get. Yet Orlok still manages to buy a house from our protagonist, estate agent Thomas Hutter. He then embarks on a journey to infect a new land, eerily floating down a river inside one of a pile of coffins, then boarding a boat whose crew he slowly feeds on until it drifts ghost-like into the harbour of Orlok's new home, the small town of Visborg, without a single person left alive on board. Orlok emerges, followed by a swarm of plague rats. He unleashes mayhem and death everywhere he goes, turning the happy lives of small-town folk into a living nightmare of disease and fear. In what is perhaps the film's best shot, and certainly its most famous, the shadow of Orlok is seen creeping up the stairs to Hutter's bedroom, so that the monster can feed on his new prey. This visual contrast between darkness and light is perhaps best demonstrated by Orlok's demise. The idea that vampires die from exposure to sunlight is first seen here, when Orlok is so distracted by feeding on Hutter's wife that he burns into a plume of smoke. The interplay of light and dark is a recurring motif of German Expressionism, cropping up in this amazing shot from Warning Shadows where a giant pair of hands cover the point where our antagonist is introduced. This film is littered with impressive lighting effects, culminating in this shot of a woman being stabbed. Similarly, the monochrome sparseness of these shots from the hands of Orlok show just how powerful these old silent films can be. As Alfred Hitchcock once said, "We should resort to dialogue only when it's impossible to do otherwise," and before sound film, every director had to tell their story primarily through visuals. This is why German Expressionism, which came at the sweet spot in between the extremely primitive cameras used in early silent film and the advent of the talkie,
I am Dracula,
is often so visually striking. Paul Lenny's Waxworks is fairly unremarkable for the most part, but it ends with another unhinged dream, this time about Jack the Ripper coming to murder our protagonist. The frames are superimposed on top of each other until he's appearing everywhere you look, filling the screen with impending danger. But perhaps the best place to find amazing expressionist visuals is Murnau's Faust, at least its first half. The film is essentially made up of one amazing special effect shot after another as demons fly through the skies or loom menacingly over a whole town, corpses are surrounded by hooded men carrying more dead to add to the pile, rings of fire engulf Faust as he summons the demon to help him rid the town of plague, writing magically appearing on paper in fire and smoke, and even this one surprisingly gory shot of the demon Mephistopheles gouging blood out of Faust's wrist to sign his contract. Needless to say, Faust's deal with a literal devil doesn't go terribly well for him, and he ends up burning to death with a woman he loves. The film is severely let down by its comparatively dull second half, which has none of the visual flair of the beginning, but it's worth watching just for the first half alone. By the late 1920s, German Expressionism was on its way out, partly because Fritz Lang's massively overindulgent sci-fi epic Metropolis cost so much and made so little back that it nearly bankrupted UFA, the main German film studio at the time. But the main reason for the movement's decline was that all the talented people making these films ran away. The Nazis were gaining power, and much of the German film industry was opposed to their ideology. As such, many of the directors, writers, set designers and actors fled the country, and Expressionism would seep into the style of other countries' films, most notably Hollywood horror and film noir. But there was one classic still to come. Fritz Lang finally redeemed himself from sort of ruining the cabinet of Dr. Caligari and nearly destroying UFA by directing a bona fide horror classic, M. This is one of the first notable serial killer movies and opens on a subtle but extremely dark note. A young girl bounces her ball against a poster offering a reward for the capture of a serial murderer. Then a shadow appears next to her. We don't see the killer's face until much later in the film. We don't see him kill her. We just see him buy her a balloon, her mother worrying, and then the ball and balloon with a conspicuous absence of the young girl. The world is suddenly empty, as if all the joy has been taken away in an instant, which of course it has. Unlike many serial killer films, M is primarily focused on the paranoia seeping through the community. People start seeing murderers everywhere. Everyone is under suspicion, and the police have got no idea where to look. In fact, by far the worst parts of M are the scenes involving the literally clueless police, because their investigation isn't going anywhere. The film then throws a total curveball when it begins to plaster shots of the killer everywhere you look. Not only that, but he is portrayed as, at least somewhat, sympathetic. Something about the ingeniously wide-eyed fear and confusion in Peter Lorre's performance makes you feel simultaneously afraid for him and wishing he would be found out. This feeling is brought into even sharper relief when the criminal underworld of the town begin their own manhunt and quickly trap the killer in an office building and begin scouring it for him. We know that if he's caught, his fate will be terrible, and he clearly knows it too. The panic in his face is infectious, and I found myself in the strange position of feeling genuinely concerned that he would be caught as the criminal's net grew tighter and tighter around him. This all culminates in his final frenzied pleas for mercy. He claims to be mentally ill, that he can't help what he does, or even remember it. I still don't know if I believe him or not, but the earnest terror on his face and his shrieking pleas left me feeling deeply uncomfortable. If only it had ended there, but unfortunately this is yet another instance where the film doesn't actually follow through, and it ends with the killer being found by the police and put on a real trial. We never find out what becomes of him, and the film wraps up with this weirdly preachy message. So, the Nazis are taking over, and the luminaries of German Expressionism have pretty much all fled. Where do we go from here? Somewhere in which horror would finally be solidified as a real genre and would explode in a dizzying array of directions. Hollywood.